Thank you very much. So tonight I'll be talking about the Homestead Act, those who settled under it, and a deep dive into the homesteading history of Summit County, Colorado, whose rich history of homesteading peaked about 100 years ago. And then finally, I'll end the program by talking about genealogical research and records and some of the resources available so that you can learn more about the homesteading roots beneath your feet. So the Homestead Act was signed into law on May 20th, 1862 by President Lincoln in order to promote westward settlement across the United States. It was this revolutionarily democratic piece of legislation because it allowed any adult citizen or someone who declared their intent to become a citizen the ability to become a landowner for free. So that meant men, women, immigrants, Latinx, African Americans. The Homestead Act was this accommodating piece of legislation extending an invitation to the world. There were a few requirements to claim land under the Homestead Act. You had to be 21 years of age or older, or the head of a household. So women were eligible as long as they were the head of the household, meaning at that point in time that single or widowed women could make a claim. You had to be a citizen or state your intent to become one. You had to build a house on the land. You had to improve the land, which meant either growing crops or raising livestock. And finally, you had to remain on the land for 5 years. The very first claim made under the Homestead Act was Daniel Freeman's when he met a land office agent at a New Year's Eve party, and he signed his paperwork just after midnight on January 1st, as soon as the law went into effect. We're located on the site of Daniel Freeman's 160-acre homestead here in Gage County, Nebraska. You can see the arrow pointing to it on the map there. But we tell the whole grand story here, all 30 homesteading states, so everything you see on the map in brown, from Florida all the way to Alaska. We talk about the 270 million acres of land claimed across the country by millions of homesteaders and their 93 million living descendants today. The homesteading story lasted more than 120 years between the first homesteader, Daniel Freeman, and the very last homesteader, Ken Deerdorf, who was a California and Vietnam War veteran who got his land in Alaska in 1988. So I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the basics of homesteading and some of the records we'll be looking at. And so I wanted to mention the Land Ordinance of 1785, which happens to share a birthday with the Homestead Act, May 20th. I created this standardized system of federal land surveys, the Public Land Survey System, or PLSS. The majority of public domain lands in the United States were surveyed and mapped out under this land ordinance, which established federal land policy for the first time. Any of the lands that were acquired after the Revolutionary War, so basically everything but the original 13 colonies and some of the early states, were surveyed under this system, and it divided land into 6 mile by 6 mile square townships, so 36 square miles, and it had 36 sections of 1 square mile, or 640 acres each. The government initially sold off these lands to generate money to pay off debts at $1 per acre for a 640 acre minimum. And in 1820, there was a reform allowing the sale of parcels as small as 40 acres for $1.25 per acre. There were other laws in the 1800s and early 1900s that allowed other ways of acquiring land through homesteading or mining, by virtue of military service, through growing trees or irrigating desert land, and more. So on this slide, we can see the base unit of the PLSS. So this is an image of one section, or a square mile, 640 acres. So the largest homestead you could get was this full section. You could get up to 640 acres, but the most common unit, at least under the original Homestead Act, was 160. So this northwest quarter here would be the size of one original homestead. And then the smallest unit you'd see, sometimes you'd see 80 acres, so a half of a quarter. So we see here W half NE quarter, so west half of northeast quarter. And sometimes you'd even see 40-acre homesteads or purchases. So for example, here we have the southwest quarter broken up into 4 equal pieces, the northwest quarter of the southwest quarter, the northeast quarter of the southwest quarter, so on and so forth. So here we see a map of principal meridians and baselines. Basically, in order to claim land, whether it was a homestead or mines or something you'd purchase or get through military service, before you could actually get that land, it had to be surveyed by the federal government. And each one of these different colored blobs on the map is a survey from a certain principal meridian and baseline. Since we're talking about Colorado, if you look here in this yellow section here, Kansas, Nebraska, Colorado, Wyoming. So this was all done from the same principal meridian. So the sixth principal meridian right here going through Kansas and Nebraska. And then this baseline. And so that's the marker, this initial point. And so for Colorado, you're talking, significantly west, usually like 60s to 80s west, and starting from this line, either south or north. And I'll show that in a little more depth later. But just to get a feel for what that looks like, here's a random sample. These numbers don't tie to Colorado necessarily, but say we're measuring from a principal meridian and a baseline. Well, if you're looking at this section right here, you would be 1 south and 1 west, right? So for this square, we are 1, 2 south and 1, 2, 3 west. So it's township 2 south, range 3 west. So say you live in Hickory Township or Washington Township. Well, according to the Bureau of Land Management, it's township 2 south, range 3 west. And within that, again, there are 36 sections of land in a sort of snaking pattern. So we have 1 through 6, it goes down 7 through 12, 13 through 18, and so on and so forth. I'm sorry? So if we're looking at section 14 here, breaks down, this is 640 acres, 1 square mile. And so we see that blown up here. You can have a quarter section, northeast quarter, or 2 half-quarter sections, or quarter sections, so on and so forth. These are some of the most common homesteading and public land laws that you'll see in Colorado. There are quite a few, literally dozens, if not hundreds of land laws across US history, but these are some of the most common. When you search on, for example, the General Land Office records, you'll see a category called authority with a date. This isn't necessarily the date that your ancestor or the person you're researching acquired their land, but it's the date that the land law took effect. So for example, if you're looking up homesteads, you'll see authority, May 20, 1862, which is the day that the Homestead Act was passed. The date that the patent or the deed to the land was issued is located at the top of the screen. So some of the ones here is sale cash entry, that was simply purchasing land outright. The Preemption Act, that was if you were on land before it was surveyed, and essentially you had the first right to claim it. The Military Scrip Warrant Acts are tied to military service. If you served in the military during wars and armed conflicts, you could receive free land. Mineral Patent Act of 1866 and 1872, so those are mining-related laws. You see that quite often in Colorado. The Timber Culture Act was tied to growing trees. Desert Land Act was tied to irrigating your land. The Indian Allotment Act was tied to Indian land dispossession, taking Native American lands that were held communally and breaking them into individual ownership. Then the Homestead Act, so we have the original law in 1862. There's a Soldiers and Sailors Homestead Act for veterans in 1872, which gave special benefits and privileges to veterans and their family. And then in Colorado, the Stock Raising Homestead Act, which raised the amount of land you could get from 160 acres to 640 if you were raising livestock. So in Colorado, I think for a lot of people, the first thing that comes to mind, especially out in Summit County, right, are the mountains. The Rocky Mountains, the highest mountain range in North America. But in a lot of eastern Colorado is the extension of the prairies of the Great Plains and what are prime homesteading areas. Even in Summit County in the mountains, homesteaders staked quite a few claims. In fact, Colorado had the third highest number of homesteads across the entire country, with a total of 107,618 homesteads proved up on 22 million acres of land. So if you look at the state of Colorado there's that square cut out in the middle. That's actually the percentage of the state that was claimed by homesteaders. The earliest homesteads in Colorado were proved up starting in September of 1869, largely in the Denver area, most of them within 20, 30 miles of Denver. So the Homestead Act, which was passed in 1862 and took effect the following year, the earliest you could actually get your land was 1869. So there were homesteads at the very beginning in Colorado, but there weren't a ton of them early on. About 1% of all of the homesteads were proved up in the first 15 years of the law. So it didn't really start to take off until the 1870s. And the major push-pull factor of early settlement in Colorado, of course, is the Pikes Peak rush. In 1860, the population of Colorado was 34,000, and by 1880, it had exploded to 200,000. But even that was still a little before the homesteading boom, which was largely between 1903 and 1928 statewide. The very first deeds to federal or public domain land that were issued in Summit County were to Henry Moore Teller in 1874. He had a mineral patent and got 3.44 acres of the Chautauqua Lode under the Mineral Patent Lode Authority of 1866, which was one of the most common types of claims in the county. Of the first 10 claims issued in Summit County, he and his brother had 3 of them. So this Mining Act of 1866 opened up mineral lands of the public domain, both surveyed and unsurveyed, to exploration and occupation by any U.S. citizen or those intending to become citizens. An unpatented claim, so a claim without the deed to it, was valid only as long as that claim was worked every single year. And a patented claim, once you receive the deed, passed title to the claimant, giving them exclusive rights to the minerals, the surface, and all resources within that claim. There were hundreds and hundreds of these claims in Summit County, stretching over 100 years, from 1874 all the way to 1983 was the very last one. Most of them were lode claims, meaning that they were deposits in veins or lodes with well-defined boundaries, including rock in place bearing minerals such as quartz bearing gold. And then there are also placer claims, which are basically anything other than lode claims, less concentrated, usually spread out over a larger acreage, sometimes over multiple sites on that claim. In terms of actual homesteads, there were 206 proved up in Summit County. So if you remember the requirements of the Homestead Act, this was intended to provide land to actual settlers in exchange for their residence on the land and either their cultivation of crops or the raising of livestock. The very first claim was in 1883, which means that he started in the 1870s. And the very last was in 1942 under the Stock Raising Homestead Act. So the very first was issued to Jesse Millsaps, who got 80 acres of land on October 26, 1883. His land was just east of what is today the Dillon Reservoir and the Lowry Air Force Recreation Area. The very last one was to William Rouse, who got 110 acres of land on May 16, 1942, a few miles northwest of Silverthorne. So the Watley family received 3 homesteads in Summit County. Robert Watley, Barney Watley, and Anna Watley all successfully proved up patents. Barney Watley, who was born in Alabama in 1885, was a lawyer who came to Summit County in 1912 as a representative for mining and railroad interests. He filed a homestead claim for 160 acres under the original homestead law and invited his family to join him, his parents, Martin and Anna, and his brother, Robert. His father, Martin, and his brother, Robert, both filed claims of their own. Barney and Robert successfully proved up in 1916, and Anna proved up her father's claim after his death, and together they received 480 acres of land. Here we can see David Doig's homestead. He was born in Scotland in 1875, immigrated to the US as a boy in 1886, and married his wife Minnie in 1905. The couple claimed 169 acres of land in 1908, just south of what is today the Green Mountain Reservoir, and they successfully proved out their patent in 1916, which was later bought out by the Knorr family, who had originally ranched on an adjacent parcel of land. And I wanted to highlight this homestead because I think it's a good way to talk about not just homesteading in Summit County, but also immigration under the Homestead Act. So this law was designed and passed into law by Congress to distribute lands in the public domain to private individuals, including immigrants who sought to become citizens. So its ability to draw in immigrants was strongly considered when they were debating it. In 1862, when the law was passed, the cost to rent, not to own, but to rent a single acre of land in England was higher than the price to file the paperwork to own 160 acres of land in America. So it represented this incredible opportunity for European immigrants. It provided the option to grow choice crops, create these communities, live where you wanted, pick the neighbors you wanted to live near. You had freedom, the right to vote, your farm, free schools for your children. Here we see some advertisements from railroad companies. And this one is for Montana specifically. This farmer, as he's plowing, is literally spilling gold coins out of the earth. And, perhaps homesteading in Summit County, that golden opportunity may actually be literally true. Here we can see a chart of homesteads under the original Homestead Act of 1862, which were successfully proved up in Summit County, Colorado between 1883 and 1939. So we see in the earliest years, there were very few homesteads proved up, only a handful before the 1890s. Though there was a big population boom between 1870 and 1880, going from a population of 250 to more than 5,000, the following decade saw the population decline back to under 2,000, and it hovered between about 1 and 3,000 until the 1970s. So the hundreds of homesteads claimed in Summit County and their families represent a significant percentage of the population in that early history. So we see that there are homesteads issued from the 1880s all the way to the 1940s, but the most active period is about here. About 1890 to 1920. And that's actually the peak of homesteading, not just in Summit County, not just in Colorado, but throughout the entire United States. There were anywhere from 2 to 10 homesteads proved up in the county every single year from that period. A pretty steady, small peaks and valleys here and there. The first peak here in the 1890s, then again in 1909, and the last wave here in 1919 to 1923. And then by the late 1920s, homestead is largely on the decline, with only a few more patents being issued over the rest of that era. So the Stock Raising Homestead Act of 1916 amended the original law. It granted much more land, a full section, but it gave access to the surface rights only, just to the grazing land. So here we can see a graph of the stock raising homesteads in Summit County. And it was most widely used in the 1920s and 1930s. So it was passed in 1916. And it took a few years to actually meet the requirements. The earliest you could possibly get land under this law was 1919. So we see that there are 14 claims in the 1920s, 12 in the 1930s, and then it really falls off in the 1940s. But though there were relatively few claims, since it was so much more land, it was 640 acres, there were more than 10,000 acres of land that were successfully proved up by Summit County homesteaders in just 20 years under this law. An average claim a little under 400 acres. The first one was Ray Henry in March of 1921 for 440 acres, and the last two in 1941, 1942 by Melvin Warren for 550 acres and William Rouse for 110 acres. So there was an interesting interaction between the Stock Raising Homestead Act and the Mining Act. The Stock Raising Homestead Act, um, certain parallels and similarities between the two. They both allowed individuals to claim public lands. They were both open to citizens and those who declared their intent to become citizens. They both required continuous improvements and or occupation. The Homestead Act, actual residency and cultivation or raising livestock. And the mining claims required labor every year until the deed was issued. The mining claims allowed co-owners with anyone who was staking a claim to also put in labor every year. If you didn't put in your labor for the year, you lost out on your share of the claim. And for homesteads and mining claims, it took 5 years to earn the patent. So with mining claims, you had to put in $100 of labor per year for a total of 5 years, $500 of labor. Now with the Stock Raising Homestead Act, though, I mentioned that they only had the surface level rights to the land, and the federal government retained the subsurface or mineral rights. So that meant that those rights, those minerals remained in the public domain, and anyone who wanted to file a mineral claim to mine on that stock raising homestead land still could if they went through the application process with the Bureau of Land Management. So the image here is a mine that was created later on what was a stock raising homestead. So the Homestead Act was this gender-neutral piece of legislation that allowed both men and women the ability to claim free land, a relatively progressive concept when the law was first passed in the 1860s. Women took advantage of that law through nearly the entire homesteading period, with the first woman to claim nationwide filing just weeks after the law took effect. She was actually a neighbor of Daniel Freeman, whose homestead I'm on here today. So the ability for women to own land under their own name was something with tremendous and far-reaching impacts, including leading the nation to women's suffrage. And in Colorado, you're one of the first states in the nation to grant women's suffrage and the first to do it by popular vote in 1893. In Summit County, there were 15 women who proved up under the original law and several more under the Stock Raising Act. While their number started out fairly low, it increased pretty substantially during the 1900 to 1920 peak. Only 2 women did so before 1900, Catherine Halloran in 1895 and Rosie Whetstone in 1898. And then it really starts picking up in the early 1900s. So I mentioned this peak a couple of times, 1900 to 1925, and you might be wondering, well, why? What's happening so late that people are filing homesteads at that point? So there are a couple of different factors at play here with the rise in homestead claims. One is that there were a series of laws changing how you homesteaded and how much time it took to claim and receive your land and how much land you could get, creating shifts towards larger and larger farms and ranches. So in 1909, you could double the size of your homestead from 160 to 320 acres. In 1912, the residency requirement was reduced by 2 years from 5 years to only 3 years. And then in 1916, of course, I've already mentioned the stock raising homestead, which doubled that land again to up to 640 acres, a full section or a full square mile. So the opportunity to get a square mile of grazing land for free was a pretty fantastic opportunity. And under that law, like I said, the earliest you could receive your patent nationwide was 1919. So you have people between 1900 and 1920 starting to claim larger and larger amounts of land. Another factor at play was the First World War raging in Europe between 1914 and 1918. So as Europe was unable to grow enough food, farmers and ranchers in America were encouraged to drastically step up production. For example, before the war, Britain imported 5,000 tons of meat from the US every year. By the end of the war, they were importing 130,000 tons, so nearly 30 times as much meat every year. And other agricultural production prices, such as wheat, also experienced a tremendous boom during the war years. But of course, what goes up must come down, right? A variety of factors led to the fall of the homesteading boom, both in Summit County and across the country. After years of prices and production levels going up and up and up, when World War I ended, that high demand for American goods fell off as post-war reconstruction took hold and allowed Europe to begin economic recovery. Unfortunately, farmers who were acquiring more and more land needed more and more equipment, and they often did so by extending on credit and taking out mortgages. So when demand fell, they were in a difficult situation, especially in the 1920s when much of the Great Plains area went through extended drought and the infamous Dust Bowl, right? So this 1-2 punch left a lot of farmers and ranchers teetering on the edge right as the US entered the Great Depression. Another major factor in the end of the homesteading area was the Taylor Grazing Act in 1934, when FDR's administration sought a series of laws to address both the Depression and the Dust Bowl. And this law saw that over decades of farming and ranching, the soil had deteriorated, allowing the Dust Bowl to go out of control. And so this law put grazing districts and stock land under management of the Department of the Interior in order to help stabilize that land. So this was basically the end of homesteading in the lower 48. It continued for another 40 years in a limited capacity and up to 1986 in Alaska, but its impact can still clearly be seen across the country. The distinct pattern of quarter, half, and full sections of land visible from the air, the homestead buildings, windmills, barns that remain, trees planted under the Timber Culture Act. So these things are still visible, but the most important impact, the lives it changed, those who pursued the American dream, became landowners. I think that that's a pretty incredible thing to look at the impact that had, the descendants who even today, they're some fourth, fifth, sixth generation and beyond, still living on the family farm and ranch. I think it's just a very powerful story which touched millions of lives here in this country. So I mentioned the very first homestead in Summit County, 1883, the very last in 42, about 60 years. One of the things that we focus on here is the story of homesteading, what it's meant to families. And so we have the Homestead Records Project. I'd like to wrap up today by talking a little bit about some of the records, the resources available out there for anyone who might be descended from a homesteader or anyone who's interested in learning more about that part of history. So over the course of the Homestead Act, there were more than 2 million homestead claims, and every single one of those generated written records known as a case file that was kept by the General Land Office. Today, they're stored in the National Archives, and the complete collection of these is over 30 million pages of documents. Since 1999, we've been involved in a project that aims to digitize all of those and help make them available to people online. To date, we have digitized 10 states, so any of the states here in the green, and the goal one day is to digitize all of those states in the white as well, have all 30 states. There are records from all of these states in some capacity, whether it's homestead land entry case files, whether it's General Land Office records, patents, tract books, and I'll talk a little bit more how to access those, but these case files are just treasure troves of historical information. They indicate the applicant, whether the patent was issued, a description of the property, the cost of the land, the date and place of birth, spouses, children that lived on the homestead, naturalization information, military service, even things like the types of crops planted, what buildings were on the homestead. So you can see that for all of these states in the National Archives. So the green states, you can see them online. So unfortunately, Colorado is not one of the ones that's digitized yet. But there are quite a few other records that we can use. And I'm going to go ahead and take a look at one of them here. Stop me if y'all are familiar with this one, but the General Land Office record, you should be able to see my browser now. So the General Land Office records are one of my favorite resources to start with. So I'm going to go to the home page here. When you first go to the website, it looks like this. So we will want to search documents. Click on that. There are a couple of different ways you can search. You can search by type, by location, where you literally just scroll into the map. You can search by identifier if you know that information. But I think the easiest way is generally to search by type. So we will search Colorado. We know the county, we know we're looking for Summit, right? You can add names. I'm not looking for anyone in particular, but you can add names. You can do legal land descriptions. So the township, the range, the section I mentioned earlier. You can specify a certain land office that you're looking for. You can say a date range. So I happen to know that the earliest is going to be in 1883. So I'll say 1883. The last will be in 1942. So I'm looking for that date range, but you don't need to add that. And then authority, as I mentioned earlier, these are all the different land laws in Colorado. Quite a few of them, but I'm looking for homesteads. So the two that you have in Summit County are Homestead Entry Original. So that's that May 20, 1862 law. And then the stock raising homestead. So I'm going to search an original first, and then I can look at a stock raising later. So we go ahead and click the authority. We've got our state, our county, date range, the type of law, and we hit search patents. We can see here there are 13 pages worth of patents. A couple of different ways you can search. You can search alphabetically, which is what it's doing right now. You can search by date, so have it set to go earliest to latest, or latest to earliest. You can search by legal land description, this information here. So go ahead and pick one from middle here, I guess. And if you want to, you can be more specific and say, I'm looking for something from range 78. Homestead Act. So once you have someone, there are a couple of things you can do with this tool. You can map it out. So this orange square is the township. There are actually two townships. It's right on the border. There are smaller orange squares. This is the section. So it's in two different sections, just north of Silverthorne here. And then the smallest and darkest orange square, that's where the actual homestead claim is. Sort of an unusual shape there. You see it's for 158 acres. Got your legal land description here. You can pull up the patent image, so the deed to the land.
Hey, Jonathan, while we're waiting for that, this is Dave. I'm very excited. Diane and I live within strolling distance of a parcel of land that is labeled the Low Ranch and Homestead, or Homestead and Ranch. And I've been trying to find history about it, and now you are showing me how to do it.
Yeah, so why don't we take a look at that? You said Low, like Lowe?
I have an assortment of names. The Lowe family bought it, according to one of the more recent owners who wrote a history. The Lowe family bought the property in 1941. It is in the town of Silverthorne. Older names are Adams and Kettenbaugh, Noble and Ruth. And the lady who wrote this little history book of her life on this homestead said there was a cabin built there at approximately 1880. So what information would be handy for this?
So do you happen to have the legal land description? Because that would be most convenient.
No, not.
Okay.
I don't have it currently.
So
it could be a project for us.
we can also search by location, and you'll have to forgive me. I don't know where exactly in Colorado I'm looking here. So if you can sort of point me in the right direction, we can look that way.
We're west of Denver,
Right,
so just slightly west of the Continental Divide, if that shows on your map.
All right, well, here is.
And that image is so small, Summit. I can't read it.
So we should be in Summit County here.
Okay, Silverthorne is to the north of that lake.
No, that's.
Oh,
this
that's
is
green.
Williams.
Green. Okay, so we need to go south of that.
Okay. Oops, I'll zoom out a little here.
I don't recognize this.
let's see what lake this is here. So this is the Green Mountain Reservoir.
So we scroll down, make the reservoir go up. Yep. Perfect.
Probably southeast a bit.
Southeast.
Well, this is
There's
in the town of
Silverthorne.
Silverthorne.
All right, so here's
Okay.
Silverthorne. So
Okay, so
if you search this way, you right click on the map, you hit map township. Oh, where in Silverthorne is it? Because we're sort of on the end of a township. Here, I'll zoom in for you here. So
what
there's the
are these
highway.
dark lines highways?
Yeah, that's 70.
70.
Okay,
And that's nine.
so
Go-
go have your cursor go straight up to the left a little bit. No, too much.
No, it's not. That's 9.
That's 9. So you see Route 9 there. It's on just right about where your cursor just was. To the left,
near
to
the
the
park?
west side of Route 9, right in there somewhere. Maybe a fraction of an inch south of that.
So here are all the people who claimed land in that area. There are 8 pages. And did you say Adams was one of them?
Adams is probably early 1900s.
So there are some Adams. Let's see here.
And this lady implies anyhow that Adams bought it from a Kettenbaugh, Kettenbough. And I don't mean to steal the show here, anybody. It's just
Interesting to see how it works.
interesting to see how it works.
Yeah.
And because it's within strolling distance of where we live, I'm trying to learn the history of it.
So I don't see a KA. Now, one thing to remember with this tool is that this is specifically just the first transfer of federal land ownership to private ownership. So usually the best thing, if you can find it, is the legal land description. So like this number here, if you can figure out the township range and the section number, that'll get you to exactly where you need to be. Otherwise,
I should be able to do that.
And if you know the name of the first landowner, that'll get you there too. Otherwise, you may have to backtrack a little bit, sort of figure out and go to that map tool and play around until you find it. And one thing that we're happy to do here at the park, if you ever do have questions and I remember in that program they were talking about using this tool, you're welcome to call us. You can email us. We're happy to help.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to go on mute, otherwise I'll dominate the show. But thank you very much, Jonathan.
Of course. So there's one other tool I wanted to share, and that's the tract books. So these tract books are what was kept at the local land office an error has occurred, to track the sale of a patent or the claim of a homestead. Just a moment here. There we go. All right, so tract books. We want Colorado. I'm just going to jump to a random page here. So the legal land description I keep talking about, this number here. Let's see if we can find a homestead. All right, like this one right here, that's a homestead, Clara Fry. So I'm actually going to do this backwards, but Summit County, Clara Fry. There she is. So we see that Clara M. Fry was a homesteader, had an original homestead for 167 acres. A little map tool here. Also, right there in Silverthorne. So her land was the east half of the southeast quarter in section 12. So right there, east half of the southeast quarter, she had that 180 acres and then 80 more acres in lot 8 and lot 9. So the tract book, right here, Clara M. Fry. So we see it says HD, that's shorthand for homestead. HD lots 8 and 9, 160 acres, plus the east half of the southeast quarter. if you ever see $10 on one of these, that tells you that it was a homestead. That was the filing fee. So sometimes you could buy land outright. Let's see if there are any on this page where someone did that. It doesn't look like it. But $10 is always the filing fee for a homestead. Now, there are going to be different dates. This date is when she filed. So this says 1900 is when she received it. 1892 is when she filed. So it took several years for her to go through the process, meet all the requirements, and get her land. And then, sure enough, 1900 is when she was done. So those tools, the tract book, the general land office record, and I'll show you this one as well. Now, unfortunately, I can't show you this for Colorado, but I'm going to search. So you go to the card catalog. This is ancestry.com. Type in the word homestead. It'll be the third on the list, U.S. Homestead Records. And I'm just going to look up Daniel Freeman, the first homesteader. Oops. Daniel Freeman. Search. So this is the case file, all of the documentation that the federal government kept showing that someone completed their homestead. I'll just scroll through it fairly quickly here. So even in Colorado where this isn't available online, it is available through the National Archives. You can either go to the archives, you can fill out a request and they'll send you this. So it is there. You can still access all this information, just not quite as easily as I'm doing right here. All sorts of information kept in these. And then I'm happy to share this presentation with anyone who's interested in it. You know, it's got some various other links and resources that you may be interested in. If you're not familiar with them, these Sanborn fire insurance maps are pretty fantastic. These are more urban, whereas homestead records are more rural, but
quick question. When you say
yes.
that the homestead, they proved their homestead, who was the proving authority? Who came out and said, okay, you've built the cabin, you've improved the land, you've grazed the cattle. I authorize the proof of your land.
Yeah, so that would be a land office agent, a federal employee for the General Land Office.
Now that was a federal employee?
It was a federal employee, yep. Worked for the Department of the Interior.
So would that have been, in our case here in Colorado, would that have been somebody based, say, out of Denver? Or were they county level individuals?
Let's see, says here Land Office Denver, at least in 1925.
Okay.
I wonder if early on if that's still the case. 1900, still Denver, yep.
So there was an office in Denver that was doing this for the state of Colorado.
So in the entire state of Colorado, there would be several land offices, and you can search each one. So these are all of the land offices that are listed for Colorado. And some of them, like Washington Office, General Land Office, Bureau of Reclamation, those are in DC. But all of those other cities are land offices in Colorado.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Can I ask a question too related to that? So obviously this is the time before the internet, so everything was paper. So the federal government recorded these records you showed us are just fascinating. So they recorded everything on paper back at the federal government, and then they must have given these people paper to bring out to Colorado and the other Western states to claim their homestead. Is that correct? Is that how it worked?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of why there's such a big delay in some of the case files, because first you had to go to the local land office, you had to go to Denver, and you testify. You'd bring two witnesses to testify on your behalf. You know, yes, John Fairchild has done everything he said he did. He built a house. He's been on the land for 5 years. He farmed that land. And so you'd all testify. They'd make sure that what you said was true. you had to actually post in the newspaper for several weeks to say, to the general community, yes, I've done all this. I'm getting ready to claim the land. And that allowed neighbors to say, hey, wait a second, John didn't actually finish. He can't get this land yet. So then once you've gone through all that process, then the claim gets sent off to Washington, D.C. They verify everything, and then they mail it back to Denver, and then Denver to Summit County. And there would be copies of all that. So the homesteader would get a copy, the land office would get a copy, the county courthouse might have a copy to make sure that they're up to date on the records as well. So quite a few paper copies out there.
So
Hey, John.
in our records at the Summit Historical Society, we've actually got a document signed by Andrew Johnson's secretary granting land to an individual for service in the War of 1812. And we'd have to go in and, as you've just shown us, and find out exactly where that is. But it's somewhere on the Front Range. That was the initial document that said, okay, you've got access to this land. This was not the final documentation, because it would have had to have been like 1866 or somewhere in there that this happened. So that would have been the initial document. And then you would get into the process you just explained, where in a certain number of years you said, I've done all of the things I'm supposed to do to improve the land, and I want pre-title.
Right. So that's land. I talked a little bit about military service earlier, right? The military bounty lands. That was in place all the way up to the Civil War. And let's see if I can. That you could claim yourself, you could transfer it, a couple of different ways you could use it. Here we go. So Scrip Warrant Act. So Scrip Warrant Act of 1812, the War of 1812. And then there were several subsequent laws, 1847, 1850, 1855. Maybe that one would be my guess.
Well, this looks to us like, since it was done after the Civil War, it looks like somebody came in and said, Granddad fought in the War of 1812 and he can get a homestead, and we should file because, obviously if he fought in the War of 1812, he was born in the 1790s or so. So this appears to be something that was taking advantage of a land authorization after the Civil War, but based on military service.
Okay, so maybe a different type of patent. So I'm going to show this one because I've got it pulled up here. And we see issue date 1867. So this one is also after the Civil War. But this is a pre-Civil War law. So it's hard to see, but there are different letters here. There's a P and a W. On all military claims, or most military claims, you'll see a P and a W. The P is the patentee. The W is the warranty. So the warranty is the person who actually served in the military, earned that land through their service, and often they would transfer or sell it. Sometimes it'd be to a family member, maybe to a son-in-law. You served in the military in the War of 1812, and as a wedding present to your daughter and her husband, you'd transfer the land and give it to them, and they'd go out and settle in Colorado. So the warranty served, the patentee received the land. Yeah, here we go. So I'm not sure if this is like the one you've got or not, but so 6th day of May, 1812, so War of 1812, warrant number, 160 acres of land issued in favor of Real, I guess, was a private and company commanded by Captain Jett of the 20th Regiment, U.S. Infantry. Is that sort of like the one that you've got?
Very much. Now, who signed that? Andrew Johnson, and I bet it says his secretary, such and such.
Right. So the last president that actually signed these directly, I want to say may have been Jackson. It was late 1820s, early 1830s. The president no longer signed these directly because at that point there was either selling or giving away so much land that, it would have been the president's full-time job to sign all these deeds. So if you
Yeah,
look at the
That's
signature
very much
here,
like ours, very much. You look at Andrew Johnson, then you look down a little further and said it was signed by his secretary.
right, and the signature itself, the handwriting is clearly the same, right? So he's just
Right.
writing Andrew Johnson, signed by.
Frank Cowan.
Yeah.
We'll have to take a look. Frank may have signed ours as well.
All right, any other questions?
Hey, John, this is Sally. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Actually, I think we should just keep you for about the next 3 days. And you can, because we see so many tools that are available to us. And to everybody on this, I know you join me in thanking John for sharing his knowledge and his expertise. And I did ask him previously when we were talking, do you remember? I said, do you want to come to Summit County? And he said, sure. You did say sure, didn't you?
I did. I sure did. I
So-
would love to come to Summit County.
Perhaps we can get you up here once we decide if it's summer or winter that you want to be here, and do a day workshop where we could really do some hands-on for people like Dave and share the resources that we have. Our theme for 2022 is homesteading, and they came for the gold, but they stayed for the land. And you, believe it or not, of those 16 questions I sent you, you answered every one. Thank you.
Very welcome. Yeah, I'd love to come out there. I'd love to come talk about this. And if you do have any other questions that I can answer remotely, I'm happy to answer by email, by a phone call. If you're interested in giving the park a call, you can reach us at 402-223-1719. And if you want to email me, my email address is Jonathan, JONATHAN _Fairchild, FAIRCHILD @NPS, as in National Park Service.gov. I'm happy to help in any way.
Thank you so much. This has just been fantastic. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.